What's up guys, Tim here from Audio Tutor. Today we're talking about synth strings or synthesized strings or pads. Essentially any of those virtual instruments that we add into the mix to fill out some of the frequency spectrum. We kind of fill out the mix with this instrument. We add an extra texture, an extra layer, an extra dimension to the mix. Usually we're talking about long sustained chords or singular notes, and we've actually already done a video that was last week about why and when we add these types of instruments into the mix and how we arrange these instruments as well. If you haven't seen that video yet, do head on over. That'll be on facebook.com/audio tutor or over on the YouTube page as well. Head on over, watch that video, and then come right back here. Welcome to this new mini-series. This is part one of a mini-series. We're going to be working our way through the entire processing chain of these cinema strings that we have here on the screen in this mix. And yes, they are synthesized strings, but this same techniques can be used on pads and any similar sort of instruments that are layering in the same way. So first off, let's have a listen. If you have watched that previous video I was talking about, then you will definitely recognize these strings. All right, let's have a listen. Alright, so on a first listen there, something you may have noticed, and I noticed as well, is that these strings sort of sound a lot like a virtual instrument. And guess what? They are a virtual instrument. They sound really sort of digital and they sound very sort of straight out the box. You can't really hear any sort of realism in how the strings are recorded, sort of thing. You can't imagine someone literally standing there playing these chords on a keyboard. It sounds too clean and digital. So the first thing we need to do to tackle that is to start adding something called saturation. Now, there are lots of plugins out there that are all about saturation, and I've got a couple of ways here for you to add saturation into a track very quickly and easily. So the first way is tape delay or tape saturation. Essentially, what you're doing is you're emulating the sound of tape. So back in the day, they would, instead of recording something into a digital audio workstation like we do, they would record straight onto tape, and that tape would give the audio a certain sound, a certain sort of crunchiness, sort of just this nice analog vibe that we've got to know and love that sound. So there are lots of plugins out there that do this emulation, but something I've found, and this is kind of a little bonus tip for you, something I've found is that a lot of these tape saturation plugins take up a lot of CPU, i.e. they make your computer go really slow and not be able to handle much else. So a way I've found of getting around that is to use a tape delay plugin, which usually take up a lot less CPU, and then you just take the delay time down to 0. And essentially what you've got then is tape saturation. There's no delay, it's just saturation. So let's have a listen here. Now this is pretty, I do warn you, you're going to have to listen hard here because this is pretty subtle stuff that we're talking about in saturation. So let's take a listen and then we'll talk about it more. Right, so it is very subtle, and you may have to rewind and listen to that bit again to really see what we're getting at here. But you probably will have noticed things got a little bit more full as we added that tape saturation in, a little bit more full in the in the sort of low mid area, and it almost sort of compressed it a bit. Essentially, you're kind of distorting the sound a little bit. So I'm going to go through again. I'm going to try and kind of emphasize it by taking this clip threshold down a bit. It's going to kind of emphasize what we're doing here, and then I'll ease it off, and you should be able to hear it a bit more easily. Now, there is another way to do this. Emulation is a big part of saturation, and many developers have emulated over the years many different famous or just very well used pieces of analog equipment. So for example, here I'm using, by Shattered Glass Audio, I'm using the Code Red. And this is emulating the Red EQ from Abbey Road Studios, which is a really famous EQ giant. It's a huge machine that was used on the Beatles on their Abbey Road album and many other amazing artists at Abbey Road Studios. There are so many different companies doing emulations of this, including Abbey Road themselves. This one is great, and when I got it, it was free, which was awesome. So Shattered Glass Audio, go and Google it. It's called the Code Red. You'll notice there are a couple of VU meters there, which are always handy. And you'll notice, and I'll play it through and I'll kind of take the input up and down and kind of show you what we're doing here. But you'll notice as we get into the red, as we get around the sort of where it says the 1, 2, 3 right here, as we get over that 0 point, you'll notice a lot of distortion, and then we'll kind of back it off again. But we're adding a lot of saturation and a lot of that, what I would call analog juice. When people would record through these old analog pieces of equipment, and people still do, of course, there is a certain sound to the circuitry in those analog pieces of equipment that we just don't have anymore with digital sound. So that's the reason these things are emulated, because we have just got to know and love that sound of analog juice. So anyway, let's have a listen to this Code Red. Alright, so you may have noticed that when I took that input gain up a bit, we really heard some distortion there, and that may be suitable for your mix if you're mixing something that needs that sound. But in our case here, we're looking for just some gentle saturation, so we're trying to keep the needle around 0 so it just gets a nice bit of natural saturation, nothing too distorted. So let's listen to the whole thing, and what I'll do is I'll take off the tape saturation and I'll take off the red EQ, and then I'll put them both back on and take them off again so we can see the progress we're making here. All right, so we are making some progress there. Things are starting to sound a bit more real, a bit more like we're really hearing that that musician play that instrument. It just sounds a bit more real, less digital, less clean and perfect, and a bit more gritty. That is part one. We're going to be moving on to part two very soon. In the meantime, guys, if you're looking to get started recording and mixing on an affordable budget, I have a free ebook, absolutely free download, a free gift from me to you. It's all about getting started. Essentially an equipment list, all the equipment you're going to need to get started recording and mixing. It's got my recommendations. It's got the equipment I started on, as well as even a chart at the back of the book to help you keep track of your spending. So do head on over to facebook.com/audio tutor to check that out. Essentially, you click a link, takes you to a landing page, you type in your email address and download the book. You can just have it on your phone or print it out or whatever. It's just an awesome point of reference. So until next time, guys, part two is coming up very soon. Until then, my name's Tim from Audio Tutor. Ciao.